Welcome to the Up Close podcast, your home for thought-provoking discussions on the present and future of public education. Today, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Marlee S. Bunch, an interdisciplinary educator, researcher, and advocate for social justice and equity. Dr. Bunch brings over 16 years of teaching experience to our conversation today and a deep commitment to providing equitable and rigorous instruction to all students. She's also a fierce advocate of culturally responsive teaching practices, learning lessons from past educators, how inclusive storytelling can be used as a framework for student-centered learning and collective healing. Her research also delves into the lives of Black female educators in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, during the period of desegregation between 1954 1971, and she explores the historical implications of public school desegregation. I'm looking forward to exploring these themes amid today's educational landscape with Dr. Bunch. So, Dr. Bunch, let's get started. Welcome to Up Close Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I am so excited and honored to be here with you today.
Awesome. And we're thrilled to hear about so many different things. Firstly, I guess your fascinating research on the experiences of Black female educators during the era of desegregation in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. What inspired you to embark on that research journey?
That's a great question. It was the start of 2020, so I think there was this outward perception that districts and schools wanted to diversify their teaching staff. But as an educator on the inside, I wasn't necessarily feeling that same message. And I knew that for Black educators, it was a difficult time, and we were all searching for answers to some of the diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives and concerns that were stirring. And so there was one evening I was talking to my mama on the phone, and she mentioned one of her mentors who was her sixth grade teacher, Mrs. Jimmy Heath, who at the time was 98 years old.
Oh my.
She had often mentioned Mrs. Heath, and she began telling another story. So I just interrupted her and I said, "Has anyone ever recorded Mrs. Heath's story?" And she laughed. She said, "Why would anyone want the story of a Black teacher from Hattiesburg?" And then it clicked. It's like, I do. I knew at that moment that there was some answer that I needed from past educators, from ancestors. I think my own experiences and the subtle messages that as Black women, we are expected to sometimes be quiet, even in our roles as educators. And so Mrs. Heath began this kind of journey of finding answers and understanding history better so that I could begin to decide how I wanted to navigate the future of education and my role as a teacher.
How inspiring and awesome. So you had an opportunity to interview this educator?
I did. She was the first participant that I interviewed. And it just kind of snowballed from there, but it was life-changing to talk to her. She taught pre-desegregation and then post-desegregation. And she, along with my grandmother and a few other Black female teachers in Hattiesburg, were tasked with desegregation and moved from all Black schools into the now integrated schools. And desegregation in Mississippi actually happened in 1971. So we know Brown v. Board happened in 54. So there were many years between when it was actually implemented in Hattiesburg, where Black educators were really trying to figure out what was going to happen, where were they going to be placed. There were all of these efforts to stave off integration. And so Mrs. Heath's story just, I think, reminded me of my own strength as a teacher. And it just helped me make sense of so many of the questions that I have. And I think one of the other life-changing things that related to my research was meeting my own mentor, Dr. Chris Spann. When I was in my doctoral program, I had never in my own education had a mentor who was a teacher. And so I think to be seen and really understood and valued as a student was really, really important. I had always been a mentor to other students, which was such an important aspect of my life, but I had never had one. So I think finding my mentor coupled with, the guidance and the stories and mentorship of the phenomenal women I interviewed, really, it was life-changing. And it was a moment for me to realize that these stories needed to be documented because so many of them had never been told. And there was all of history that had never been illuminated. And so my goal was to write it and document it and make sure that it's there for not only future generations, but I think future teachers as well.
I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm wondering if you're willing and able, according to whatever arrangements you might have with those ladies that you interviewed, are you able to share some of the stories that impressed upon you the most?
Yeah. So two of the participants that I had the honor of interviewing, one was Dr. Joyce Ladner, and she actually, she's a civil rights activist and has since become one of my mentors, but she was a student in my grandmother's class when she was in kindergarten. She started kindergarten at the age of 3 and happened to be in my grandmother's class. And so I got to interview her. And then I also got to interview Ellie Damer. She is the wife of former slain civil rights activist Vernon Damer, who, both of them advocated fiercely for voting rights. But I think the biggest lesson that I took from all of the participants, but specifically from the two of them, was this idea of collaboration and being in community. I think as teachers, sometimes we think, we're so isolated in many ways. And so I don't know that we always think in this community way that it seems like educators during that time and during the movement really, really centered their efforts on being in community. When I actually think about culturally responsive teaching, I wonder, I had a moment where I was like, I wonder if this even needs to go a step further and we need to think about community immersion, because all of the stories, like hearing Dr. Ladner talk about organizing the March on Washington, hearing participants talk about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, those were all efforts for great change and activism, but they were done really in lockstep with people from all over who came to Mississippi and were literally on the ground working towards the same goals and the same, justice that my participants were. And so I think that was one of the biggest lessons, this idea of what can we do if we work from, as they called it, bottom-up organizing, and we immerse ourselves in community with others to create longstanding change. So that was one of the many lessons. I think some of the other lessons were the idea that teachers really work to prepare students to be civically engaged. I think especially before desegregation, you had Black spaces that were protected and Black identity was celebrated. And so educators worked really hard to not only, I think, inspire students, but to make them very aware that they were entering a racialized world and that they were part of the solution towards change. And so students, I think, left those teachers' classrooms ready to kind of fill the shoes of the activist before them, so to speak. I also think curriculum at that time was creative, and I think it was culturally responsive before we had a term for it. It involved history, it involved Black history. Mrs. Heath told a story how she would bring in magazines and she would say, okay, students, we're going to go travel today. And I just thought, wow, isn't that amazing that at a time and at schools where, you hear, oh, Black schools had no resources and that was all true. But I think the story we don't get is that we had teachers who in so many ways filled in those huge gaps of lack of resources, and they were operating in, Jim Crow South. And I think they worked really, really hard for students. And I never once heard any of my participants, when they talked about teaching before integration or after, they never said my Black students, my white, it just was students. They all said, I loved my students. I wanted to be a teacher. I was going to do whatever I had to do to do what was best for students. And so that idea of like forming relationships and serving the whole child, that was another theme that really kind of rang through really loudly.
You know, my mother was an educator, a leader of Rosenwald schools in Mississippi, probably around the same era, those women that you interviewed. And as you have spoken, you have evoked so many memories of how she has described how she and her colleagues approached the classroom in that era, clearly before deseg. And I'm just wondering, Dr. Bunch, as you reflect on what you heard from these educators in your own experience, how would you compare and contrast what you heard from them to what educators are experiencing today, particularly educators of color?
Yeah, I mean, we can never underestimate what educators were facing in the Jim Crow South. So I want to make that very clear. But I think one of the biggest messages I heard is that you can do a lot with a little, and sometimes it's those simple things that make the biggest difference. I think right now we have racial battle fatigue, we have teacher shortages. I think we're faced with the fear of being in schools or districts that might not want inclusive history. And maybe even on the outside, a continuation of that sense that I felt in 2020, which is, oh, we really want a diverse staff. But then once you're in the building or you're in the district, I think as a Black educator, you realize really quickly whether that's accurate or not. And so I think we're still faced with that. And I think we still have so many inequities that exist between Black and Brown students and schools that are deemed, Title I or high risk versus, our suburban schools. And so I think some of the crossover is very similar. And that's what struck me, I think, when I was doing the research is, wow, some of this is really, really cyclical. And I think it helped me kind of see where some of it stemmed from and it helped me understand, like, where did private schools come from? I think I had grown up always hearing Black teachers aren't in the classroom because the pay is low. And it for me was like, that doesn't seem right. And so learning about, what happened to Black communities, Black families, Black teachers during desegregation really shed light for me on, wow, I think this is why so many of the things that we struggle with now exist as Black teachers, and maybe not seeing the representation we want. I think it's very much connected to that past history.
And as you've reflected on it, I know you have authored a book, The Magnitude of Us. And can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah. So I wanted to create two books. And the first one I wanted to write was the stories and the oral histories of the participants that I interviewed. And so that will actually be out in 2025. And I'm really excited about that because that was my way of preserving that history. So that will be through the University of Illinois Press, and that's forthcoming. But in addition to that, I really wanted to create something that was action-oriented, that any teacher could pick up and kind of bring the lessons and the voices that I had heard into their classrooms. I fear that when we say culturally responsive teaching, I'm not sure that all teachers know what that is. And I think we have a lot of barriers as educators when we think about how are we going to actually sustain, not just create, but sustain culturally relevant classrooms. And so I think the answer for me was this ancestral knowledge, these past lessons. And so creating this book, I think, was my nod to that. And I wanted to also create things that had lesson plans, that had visuals, that didn't ask you to start over, but basically was a guide so that if you have existing activities and lessons, you could also use this book to revise some of that to make it richer and deeper. And I also wanted to include a section for pre-service teachers because I think that's an area that we don't talk a lot of. I don't know if we talk enough about it, but preparing our teachers to go into classrooms when we know they are becoming more diverse and yet our teaching population remains predominantly white. I think we've got to do a better job preparing our pre-service teachers to enter the classroom. And so there is a section in each chapter specifically dedicated to pre-service teachers entering the field.
That's wonderful. And entering the field, able to offer a culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining curriculum. I want to go back to something you said because our listening audience comes from wide and far. Many are educators, but not all. So when you talk about culturally relevant, responsive, and sustaining, as I often put it, curriculum and pedagogy, what do you mean?
I think initially, the term has taken on lots of different variations, which I appreciate because I think building off of an initial concept is really important. But for me, I think it means meeting students where they're at and finding ways to affirm and challenge them. And then I think it's also, the phrase windows and mirrors. Can students see themselves in the classroom? And then can also see the perspective of other people and cultures and communities. And so I would say that's my definition of it.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Another idea that you've put forth that we've been introduced to through you is this idea of the hush. Mm-hmm. And I've taken great delight in reading about and learning about what you mean when you talk about the hush. Can you introduce that to our audience?
Absolutely. I think if you say to most Black women, when have you ever been silenced or felt hushed? I think almost all of us would have a moment we could identify. What struck me is I think I expected to find that similar silence amongst the educators that I interviewed, and I didn't. And I actually asked Dr. Ladner about that. I said, I think as Black women in spaces, there is this assumption, I think in a lot of ways, or at least I'll speak for myself, I felt this assumption that I was supposed to be quiet. We want you, we know you're a great educator, and so we're going to hire you on, but it's going to be with this understanding that you are going to do certain things and you're going to act a certain way, comply, things of that manner. And that's really exhausting. I think when we think about like racial battle fatigue is the term often used now, I think that is a part of it. And so I asked Dr. Ladner about it, and she said, my generation never felt that hush. We were not hushed because we saw the pictures of Emmett Till. We knew and heard about the lynchings. We understood very clearly that not using our voice was not an option, and that we were expected from our elders and from our teachers, we were expected to be advocates for change. And that to me was such a moment where it was like, yes, I think it's such a validation and an important reminder of using our voice, even when it might be uncomfortable, even when much is at stake. I was just blown away that, I think lives were at stake when we think about educators then. Your life in many ways was at stake if you used your voice in a way that the White Citizens Council or whomever in the community maybe didn't like. And yet these women did it anyway. And so I think that unlearning piece really was like, this is a part of it. This is really an important part of when we talk about culturally sustaining pedagogy. That unlearning and that reminder of using our voice, I think is really paramount.
So what does that look like day to day in a classroom, possibly, Dr. Bunch? I'm thinking about how you are possibly putting together in your mind and for those who will read your book, what you learned from these educators of the past, what you're observing going on in classrooms today, what you're understanding to be the resistance to culturally responsive practices in some places. And here you are in a leadership role in informing others through a book in other ways. How are you putting all that together?
Oh, that was a tall task. I tried to do it in a way that made it okay to make mistakes. I went back and interviewed my former students because I credit them for becoming the teacher and the leader that I am. I give all of that credit for the most part as a teacher to my former students. I learned so much from them. So I actually went back and asked them. And for some of them, they had me, oh my goodness, 15, 16, 17 years ago. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I asked them now as an adult, what stuck with you? What did we do in the classroom together that worked, that was impactful, effective? And they all said very similar things, that giving them the space to use their voice. We did a lot of Socratic seminars. I think naturally I always worked to center their voices because in my own classrooms growing up, that was not a space that I felt I was ever given. And so that was very important to me when I taught. So inquiry-based learning, Socratic seminars, time to journal. We had something called bridging, where on Fridays I would use the last 15 minutes of class and they could ask each other questions. They could share aspects of their life. And I think in doing all of those things, what happened is it just built this classroom that, as they described, felt safe to them. And so I think it gave us room to make mistakes, to have really difficult conversations. We read a book called Some of My Best Friends Are Black by, I should remember it now, and I'm going to forget it. But there's a chapter that looks at redlining and blockbusting in Kansas City. And I had ninth graders, and I remember the principal saying, you want to pilot this book with ninth grade students, and you want to have discussions about race and redlining with the ninth graders? And I said, yeah. And we spent a lot of time setting up, expectations and classroom agreements. And I wish that I would have videoed those discussions. They were some of the most effective, meaningful conversations about inequity and race that I've ever witnessed in my life. And I essentially trusted my students enough, after I had walked them through how to do it. Here's how you lead a discussion. And I think that's hard as a teacher, to kind of give up that sense of control, because there's so many things that could go wrong. But I think that that's one of the things that has allowed me to be effective with students in the classroom.
That is so powerful. I'm hearing you bring to these students and the classroom through these exercises and that experience and healing and restoration, self-exploration, and we know the value of these things as kids come into their sense of self-efficacy. Yet so much that goes on in the education arena is focused on student outcomes and how things improve student outcomes.
Yeah.
I have my own interpretation of how that all that you bring will certainly support positive student outcomes. But would you speak to that?
Yeah, Goldie Muhammad, I love Goldie Muhammad, but she does a great job in her most recent book talking about assessment and student outcomes. And we know that there's so many inequities that are embedded systemically in that alone. And so I think as educators, if we can just reframe, and it's so hard, right? Because there's pressure, obviously, as teachers to perform and that your students do really well. But I think I just always felt like if I love these students, if I make learning interesting, and it sounds probably oversimplified, but my take was always, if I do those two things, everything else will fall into place. And I remember, we would do art. I think art and, I'm an English teacher, so literacy and words and art, those are all things that I think are very, very important to classrooms, especially when we think about celebrating cultures and communities. Historically, art and words, those are two things that I think really help kind of usher in that idea of storytelling and honoring histories that are often marginalized. But we would do, things with art, and we would do kind of these more creative things. And I remember a teacher asking me once, how do you have some of the highest EOC scores and your students look at art? And I thought, because if you are doing good teaching, if you're teaching students how to analyze, how to have discussions, critical inquiry, all of those things that we know make for the foundation of good learning, I think the arts are a part of that. And I think students respond when they see real world or feel like learning has some real world connection. And so I would always work to try to bring in things that were connected to them in the now so that they could, question their world in a way that not only allowed them to find their voice, but again, that perspective taking, this idea of appreciating other voices and other people was always, I think, a primary concern for me as an educator.
Your words are so inspiring. We know a lot of educators want to follow this path as well, and they want to be engaged in culturally responsive pedagogy, and yet facing so much resistance to that in some places. How do you encourage educators? What would you say to educators who are confronted with those challenges?
Oh, yeah, that's difficult. I think educators are asked to do so much right now. And so I think the first thing I would say is, if you can look at culturally responsive teaching as an integral part, something that's infused throughout your classroom, from the walls to the lessons to your interactions with students and family and communities, I think if we can make it part of what we do every day, I would say that's the first step. And then the second part is I would say voting is so important. When we think about school board elections, for example, we know that school board elections are so important when we think about textbook selections, curriculum, leaders in districts. And I would also say Vanessa Siddle-Walker, she's a historian that I leaned on a lot as I did my own research, and I have such an appreciation for her. But one of the things when she did her own research for the lost education of Horace Tate, which similar, right? Looking at histories and stories that have not been illuminated in Black education. But one of the things she talked about was how Black educators were so good during that time period of kind of finding these covert ways of meeting, planning, right? We're thinking about a time when Black educators, we couldn't be part of some of the teacher associations, for example. So they would create their own teachers associations, and they would meet, and principals were kind of the front lines to make sure that they could do what they needed to do in regards to curriculum that they knew was best for Black identity and all the things we've discussed. So I think there's really something to be said for finding what we call now maybe affinity spaces outside of our schools, outside of our districts, meeting and collaborating and finding these coalitions, because there really is power in numbers. And so I think sometimes we feel so bound by what, a leader or a district is doing, but really there's such great power. And Vanessa Siddle-Walker illustrates that beautifully in what happens when teachers come together collectively and say, no, we know this is what's best for students, and so this is what we are going to do. And so I would encourage that. And again, just that idea of moving past fear. I had a student once say, how much are you willing to lose for us? And I thought, wow. And the answer for me was everything. To stand up for students, to make sure that my students were receiving equitable treatment and things of that nature. It was always like, anything, I'll do anything. And I realized, there's much at stake. So not every educator can have that perspective, but I think again, building that coalition, building collaboration, and having that strength in number, at the very least, reduces some of that fear, I think.
Thank you for that. Can you also share what you see as some best practices for centering historically marginalized voices and perspectives?
Yeah, I think, again, this is where I think, in the book, I talk a lot about bringing in poetry, bringing in artwork. I took an Asian American class in my doctoral study because I realized for me that was a gap. I'm like, I know a lot about different histories, but in this specific area, I definitely need to know more. And so I took this course, and it was great. But one of the things that I learned in that course was the story of Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X. And they had this beautiful friendship. And I was stunned because growing up, I knew that I had read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I felt like I knew quite a bit about his story and his life. And then to come across this whole portion of his life where he worked with Yuri Kochiyama and they advocated for Asian American rights, Black rights. I mean, their story is just the most beautiful thing. And I think what it does is it illustrates how if you find out more about other histories and other cultures, you often find out additional things about your own. And so I think that aspect of storytelling, bringing in histories of people who aren't often celebrated. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer. And I just wonder if students knew about some of these coalitions, some of these really compelling histories. I think we could work towards building a sense of understanding and empathy and celebration instead of just tolerance. Because I think sometimes, we get a little bit caught up in this idea of calendar, what I call like calendar celebrations. So for example, maybe you say, May is Asian American Pacific Islander month. So as a teacher, I'm going to do something to kind of check that box. And so I think if we can move our thinking away from calendar celebrations, and again, just towards this idea of what happens if we learn each other's untold celebrations and untold histories, I think we learn more about ourselves and are able to bear witness to each other in a way that, helps us naturally kind of create those connections and points of really meaningful learning that can happen.
That is such a hopeful vision. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Bunch, I'd like to ask you, as you think about hopefulness and the bright future, a possible bright future, what gives you hope for the future of public education, particularly in as pertains to promoting equity and justice?
Wow. I hope that we can move public education to a space where we see more teachers and leaders of color. I think that has to happen so that students, when we think about seeing yourself in the classroom, I think that that's a vital aspect of education. I also hope that we can move our thinking into a space of education as a place to learn, and we're going to make mistakes. I think we all have more to learn when it comes to culturally responsive pedagogy. I think as educators, that idea of consistently learning, relearning, unlearning has to be present. My best friend actually is a teacher at Ella Flagg Young in Chicago Public School, and she's a phenomenal teacher. But the other day she said, I'm in a program now, so I'm taking classes at night. And she's taught for probably 20 years. And I said, why are you in another program? And she said, because I need to get my ESL certification so I know how to meet the needs of my English language learners. And I said to her, and that's why you're a phenomenal teacher. Just this idea of teachers like that who are always willing to do whatever it takes to meet the needs of all of their students. And I also recently met a young woman named Chrissy Kim, and she's in the teaching program at the University of Illinois. And so to talk to her and to hear the way she approaches what type of teacher she'll be makes me so hopeful, because she is fiercely dedicated to learning about all people and celebrating that with her students and bringing it into the classroom one day. And so that makes me very hopeful.
I'm really appreciative of your answer, so consistent with the views of the NEA Foundation as we view educators as the hope of public education. Really, really great to hear you say that. You know, Dr. Bunch, we're nearing the end of our time together, but there are 2 questions I like to ask everyone that comes on the Up Close podcast, so I'm going to pose them to you. Firstly, if you could speak to policymakers about all that you have reflected on and shared with us today, what recommendations might you make as pertains to policy in public education?
Ooh, you saved the hard question for the end. I think I would urge policymakers to model the states, such as I'm thinking about Illinois. They had the TEACH Act, which is teaching equitable Asian American community history. And so I think inclusive history and illuminating those histories in some states is really, really, we're building a solid foundation for. So I would encourage them to follow the models of the states who are doing that. I would also say that trusting educators to create and implement their own curricula and have some choice in textbooks is so important. I think teachers work really, really hard for the most of the teachers that I've met, they work really hard to do good work. And so I would say we've got to give that autonomy and trust back to our teachers so that they can do what they know is best for students instead of fighting against some of these inequitable policies or expectations that really just draw energy out of our teachers and I think leave us in a little bit of a situation that we're seeing now with teacher shortages and teacher burnout. And so I would say give the power back to the teachers and let them do what they were trained and hired to do.
Love that answer. Thank you so much, Dr. Bunch. And then lastly, because we know that a high quality and wonderful public education doesn't just rest on educators, but that there's a role for everybody in the community to play to advance the best in public education. What might you offer our general audience as they are also concerned and thinking about how to make schools in general more culturally responsive and sustaining?
That's a great question. I think community piece is so important. And so again, I think voting and specifically voting in our school board elections, I think is incredibly important. Vote in every election. Vernon Damer historically said, if you don't vote, you don't count. And that's so true. And I think right now, educators need the community backing them so that we can make some of these changes that we know are important. I also think having family involved in school is such an important thing. And so I would urge families, if teachers have not extended that olive branch or invited you in, be a part of it anyway. Find a way to be involved no matter what. And I think things like textbook selection, oftentimes those are districts will send out emails and they will invite parents or community members in to come and be a part of those discussions. And I would urge, community members and families, if you get those invitations, absolutely go and voice your concerns and your feedback, because I would always tell my students, never underestimate the power that you have. in a school. And so I would say that same thing to families and community members, that at the end of the day, you have that power. And so just make sure that you're exercising that right.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. And Dr. Bunch, just wonderful. It's been great to be with you for this past half hour. So enlightening and inspiring. I could follow up just with everything you said, probably for hours, but time does not permit. I just want to thank you for being with us today and welcome you perhaps in some future time back to Up Close. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today. If you like what you have heard here today on the Up Close podcast, be sure to subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And after you do that, go back and listen to all the great episodes that perhaps you've missed. Thanks again for tuning in today. I look forward to our next conversation.